Okay, welcome back to the Global Landscapes Forum here in Bonn, where we are focusing on rights in the landscape. And this afternoon I have with me Andrea Carmen, who is the member of the Yaqui Indigenous Nation in Sonora, Mexico and Arizona, USA. She's also the Executive Director for the International Indian Treaty Council. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Natasha.
It's a real pleasure.
For me also.
Thank you. So please tell us more about your work with the International Indian Treaty Council.
The International Indian Treaty Council was founded in 1974 on Standing Rock Reservation. Now everybody's heard of Standing Rock.
Right, exactly.
Wasn't the case a couple of years ago, but that was in 1974, and we were given the directive by the elders because of the lack of justice within the United States and the other colonial governments in the Americas to find a seat at the United Nations, at the family of nations, as nations with treaties and with governments that had existed for many, many thousands of years on our homeland. So we've been working in the international arena since that time. We're the first international indigenous organization to have consultative status with the UN Economic and Social Council. And in 2001, we were upgraded to what's called general consultative status, the only indigenous organization with that standing at the United Nations, because we work in so many different fields. Mm-hmm. We started out in the human rights arena. We're very active in a leadership role on developing and bringing about the UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples that was adopted finally after 30 years right. at the UN General Assembly in 2007. And now we're working on implementing it. Of course, you know, the states that all supported it and have now all states supported, mm-hmm. the 4 that voted against, including the one that I live in, the United States, have all changed their position. But the real challenge is implementation on the ground, you know, with recognition of land and treaty rights, free, prior, and informed consent mm-hmm. for indigenous peoples before development happens on our land, and respect for our traditional cultures, sacred sites, and our traditional knowledge, which is what brings us here to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. We, with indigenous peoples from around the world, fought very hard for indigenous people's traditional knowledge about the relationships with the natural world, our traditional food systems, our ways of knowing through ceremony and through daily practice and interchange with the natural world has a lot to contribute to the discussions on climate change. And it is such an emergency. Our elders don't even like to say climate change. They say climate crisis or right. climate emergency, that we all need to get on board. The International Indian Treaty Council represents indigenous peoples in 5 regions, mm-hmm. from the Arctic all the way through the Americas to South America, the Pacific Islands and the Caribbean Islands. Oh. So we bring those voices of our knowledge holders and our activists, including youth and elders, to this discussion. And I was selected by indigenous peoples in North America to have a formal position on this new UN body called right. the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples Platform, the Facilitative Working Group, and we met for the first time.
This week, right?
Yeah, this week, well, about a week ago.
Okay.
And the amazing thing, from a rights perspective, which is something we've been working for more than 40 years, this is the first time in the history of the United Nations that indigenous peoples have had direct representation, not selected through a UN body, but direct representation on an equal standing with the nation states. So we have 7 indigenous members of the working group and 7 state members, country members. Okay. And we have been working together. We have to come to consensus. That's what we're charged with. And it's not necessarily been easy, but we've been able to achieve finishing a work plan last mm-hmm. night at 8 o'clock. Okay. 6 hour, felt like 6 years, right? Yeah. 6 hour session. And Canada and Bolivia are 2 other countries from the Western Hemisphere that are part of the working group, and all the regions are represented, as well as small island states mm-hmm. and least developing countries. and then the 7 indigenous regions. So it's really quite an exciting step forward, not only because climate change is such a critical issue for us and affects all of us, and our children, our young people, the children yet unborn are the ones who are really going to face the consequences of the result of unsustainable, unrespectful development. And that doesn't take human rights into consideration or the integrity of the natural world. So
do you think, I mean, it's a massive step. It's taken a long time to get here. And I guess we were discussing earlier, it's because we're at this crisis point where they're realizing that, you know, we have to incorporate traditional knowledge into policies to change how things are working. How do you think that's going to happen? How are we going to be able to incorporate traditional knowledge to impact national and international policies?
Well, that's what we're talking about. There's 3 objectives or purposes of this new body. One is knowledge and finding out how we're going to exchange knowledge, but also strengthen the traditional knowledge and practices, which doesn't happen at the UN. That can only happen in our nations, in our communities. The next is capacity building, and we're saying not only do we need to build capacity of indigenous peoples to engage in this process, but the countries need capacity building of how to understand what we're talking about. You know, how to take on board the knowledge and the contributions of indigenous peoples. And then the last is actually policy and action around climate change. So that's going to be the challenge. Are they going to listen to us when we say that if they keep going with this addiction to fossil fuels around the world, our knowledge will only be a Band-Aid? You know, we're just going to have to hunker down and survive in our communities. And we do have time-tested methods that we are strengthening and reviving in the Americas. We've had 4 International Indigenous Peoples Corn Conferences where we're coming together to talk about what we're doing to protect this core traditional food that's part of our creation stories and in our ceremonies. You know, how we can begin to trade again our original seeds, and, you know, not GMOs, but original seeds that are drought resistant, that some indigenous peoples have seeds, corn that grows in 40 days from planting to harvesting, little plants and little ears, but they mature in 40 days. And with the uncertainty about the weather, the rains are coming at different times, the temperatures are extreme, both hot and cold, and it's interesting because the United States, in the middle of the United States, is the only land body in the world that is right between an Arctic landmass and a tropical ocean, the Caribbean, with no mountains or any kind of barriers. So all that meets in the middle, and we're seeing tremendous flooding and tornadoes and storms. It was snowing in South Dakota in May when I was there, and you know, people. But I'll tell you a secret here. There was a freak snowstorm in South Dakota a couple of years ago. It came in September, and 100,000 cattle died. You know, the imported cows that we have all over the place now in the U.S. And many tribes are working to restore and bring back the buffalo as a core traditional food source that was purposely destroyed by colonization by the United States. And now it's coming back. The buffalo are coming back. And you know how many buffalo died in the freak snowstorm? Zero. None. Because they know how to withstand that. And they can survive in drought and in snowstorms and blizzards, and they also don't tear up the plants like cows do. They clip the plants, so they spread the seeds of the native grasslands. So indigenous peoples, this is just another example, like reviving our traditional seed trading, you know, that we always had, you know, pre-colonial times. So these are just 2 examples of ways that indigenous peoples are using our traditional knowledge and methods, our traditional relationships with our spiritually, culturally, nutritionally, economically important food sources to adapt to the climate change. And we're willing to share because of the emergency here, but we have to lay human rights frameworks down and safeguards before we even invite our traditional knowledge holders into this process to exchange knowledge. And it's not just about exchanging it with the states, we are exchanging it with each other. Because many of us have different methods that, water saving and our traditional plants and seeds that we can exchange because our climates are changing and we need each other as Indigenous peoples. And let's see, how respectful they are of our rights for us to engage in exchanging with the United Nations and with the states, and that's what we have yet to find out if that can happen.
Exactly, because that's the most important thing right now. It's putting rights at the forefront of this crisis.
Absolutely.
And once they're respected and appreciated, then we can move forward, right? And they're brought to the table. And
exactly
that's
right.
What needs to be done.
We worked on that even last night. We were finalizing our work plan for the new platform, and tussling a little bit with some of the governments, that don't yet understand what rights have to do with environmental protection. We're saying, 80% of the world's biodiversity, the United Nations says, is on those remaining lands that are controlled and cared for by Indigenous peoples. So it was really clear to us as they start looking at ways to mitigate climate change, they're going to have their eye on what we've been able to protect. So how are we going to engage? We want these things protected. We want the planet to be protected. But we also need for our rights to be protected and respected, and our methods and traditional knowledge about taking care of things and that relationship with the natural world is something that they also have to take on board.
Yes, very true. Well, thank you so much for your time. I think that was really important interview and a great story, and I really do hope that the world is listening right now and putting rights at the forefront of the agenda in this environmental crisis.
We think the only reason that they've actually given us a formal space, because I demonstrated in Copenhagen and Cancun demanding a voice, even at Paris, where this platform was adopted in the Paris Agreement. It was part of the Paris Agreement. To take on board Indigenous people's traditional knowledge. We couldn't even get in the rooms of negotiation. We had to hear what they were talking about by people that were bringing us the information. So, now we have a formal seat at the table, and we think it's because they are truly desperate. They must be. But nevertheless, we are part of the human family and here to help, and we have to. For the survival of our future generations, we have to be part of this discussion.
Yes, we do. Well, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.